Thank you very much for attending another event of the Observatorio, or your first event at the Observatorio. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Cristina Pato, and I'm very grateful to her, and I'm very proud to have her here today to commemorate International Women's Day, something we started doing last year. Yeah. And I must say that Cristina accepted my invitation immediately with warm enthusiasm. So I really want to express my deepest and sincere thanks to her. Let me introduce her a little bit, because most of you probably know of her or about her, but I'd like to say a few things about her before she starts talking and playing her wonderful music. Cristina, as you probably all know, is a master of the Galician bagpipe, the gaita, as we call it in Spanish. But she's also a classical pianist and a passionate educator. You'll see that this evening. In fact, the New York Times once described her as a virtuosic burst of energy. And she's devoted her professional life to cultural exchange and also to forge new paths for the Galician bagpipe, which she started playing when she was only 12 years old. And she has been the first female gaita player to release a solo album. So congratulations for that. Cristina has performed on major stages throughout the world and has released and produced 6 solo gaita albums and 2 solo piano recordings. And she has also collaborated with artists on more than 40 albums from different music genres, from world music to classical music, jazz, and also experimental music. For example, she took part in the well-known album with Yo-Yo Ma, yes, which was called, I've got the name here, Yo-Yo Ma and Friends, Songs of Joy and Peace, which won a Grammy Award. And another famous album was the jazz album Miles Español, New Sketches of Spain. I suppose that was a response to the famous Miles Sketches of Spain, yeah? And but education is also a critical part of Cristina's personal and professional life. She serves as learning advisor for Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road project and has been an artist in residence in several universities, including Harvard University, but also the University of California, where she has taken part in interdisciplinary projects like a very interesting one on the connection between art and neuroscience and memory, the loss of memory. I've read that she's got a beautiful piece devoted to memory, to the loss of memory, called My Lethe Story, The River of Forgetfulness, which is a storytelling chamber music piece, which was actually premiered at Harvard, and in which Cristina combines her passion for neuroscience and the personal story of her mother's memory loss. I'll just end by saying that she actually holds a doctorate of musical arts from Rutgers University. She has degrees in piano and music theory and chamber music from the Conservatorio de Música del Liceo in Barcelona, as well as a Master of Fine Arts from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona as well. And during the current year, she's holding the chair of Spanish Culture and Civilization for the King Juan Carlos I Center at New York University, NYU. So I suppose you agree that it is a real honor and pleasure to have Cristina as our guest to celebrate this very special day. Thank you, Cristina.
I'm very loud, and I am muted for the camera, and I am aware of that, but this is my welcome to this evening today. Thank you. Well, among all the things you could be doing on a Friday, you chose to come to see a bagpiper talking about whatever it is that I am going to be talking about in here. I'm incredibly grateful. Thank you so much. Gracias de corazón. I've been connected to this institution for the last, I don't know, Lori, like 10 years, more or less. And this is the first time I'm actually connected to the Instituto Cervantes at Harvard University. And the reason I said yes so quickly was not only because of the personal connection that you put together, but also because for me, contributing in both sides of the Atlantic is something that is very important, since I just became a US citizen, in what that means in today's society. So carrying two passports makes me feel twice as responsible as I felt before. And these are very unique times to carry those two passports. And I can recognize some familiar faces in here, and I think you can hear me well in the back. If not, just let me know. I also have a very thick Spanish accent that I am really proud of, and I understand that maybe more than half of the room speaks Spanish in here, but I wanted to invite friends that are coming from other languages, so I thought that maybe English was the vehicular languages in here. So what are we into today is a little bit of everything. First of all, as Marta was saying, to me there is something very important about redefining the role of an artist in academic institutions. And throughout today's lecture, we will learn a little bit of how have I thought on how to connect the dots between all the disciplines that I've been working in the past, and how that idea of being in between, of becoming a professional in-betweener, as an immigrant, as a musician, and as an educator, somehow became my career, and that's somehow the way I'm trying to build my life. But before that, I'm going to bore you to death with the fascinating history of bagpipes. Because I know you came for this. You were dreaming about learning about the fascinating world of bagpipes, and that's where I am going to take you. So if I were to ask you, where do you think is the origin of the instrument? And those of you from Galicia, please share your ideas too. Where do you think is the origin of the instrument? What would be the first country that comes to your mind?
Scotland.
Scotland, right? Is there any other country?
France.
Iran, France, Ireland, Central Europe. That's wonderful. Bulgaria, yes. Well, you are all right. That's the beautiful thing about this instrument. Bagpipes were shepherd instruments. So wherever there was a shepherd, I don't know where to place myself so you guys can see in the back, but right here is good? Okay. So wherever there was a shepherd in the world, there was a kind of bagpipe. And to me, it's fascinating to look at a map like this one, which is like from the year 200 before our era, that gives us a little bit of a sense of the many different cultures that were living around the Mediterranean Sea. There are many theories about what is the origin of the instrument itself, but we probably have to trace it to the Mediterranean cultures. And we probably have to trace it to Persia too, and to this idea that what were the first civilizations using this instrument. So historically speaking, we do have like documents talking about something that may be a bagpipe during the Persian times, but also during the Greek times and the Roman empires. But the reality is, wherever there was a shepherd, there was a kind of bagpipes. And as all of you were saying in here, yes, there are bagpipes in Bulgaria, and it's called gaida. There are bagpipes in Germany, many different kinds of bagpipes in France, in Iran, and all around the world. So to me, it's fascinating to understand that there is like a parallel reality of bagpipe nerds in which we all know each other and we connect to each other there. But then once you step out of that unique reality, you realize that what you do may or may not be relevant to the other side of the population. And somehow what I've been trying to do is to understand why is it possible that an instrument that is thousands of years old and didn't make it to most of the history of music books as we understand them today is an instrument that has survived and survived through community and through people. This is a map of my country. Actually, this is a map of the Iberian Peninsula around the year 900. And I wonder how many of you in this room know what Al-Andalus was? Yeah, one volunteer, like one share.
Islamic Spain.
Islamic Spain. So that's a very unique moment in history, and it's probably one of the most important ones, because for centuries and centuries, we had a unique part of the country that was Islamic Spain, but in which Sephardic Jews and Christians were all living together, and it probably, culturally speaking, that was one of the richest times of the Iberian Peninsula. What happens in this map is very unique to me, because we start having like that little thing over there in the northwest corner where I come from, the Kingdom of Galicia. And then we fast forward a little bit, and we fast forward like 200 years, and then we see somehow how history reminds us that we are repeating, repeating ourselves, or we are rhyming constantly. But this is a map of the Iberian Peninsula in which, what is going on in there? For those of you that are connected to Spanish history, what is La Reconquista, right? Which started like somewhere in the north in there, and it went pushing from north of down. So in that Reconquista, to make a very long story very short, let's say that Muslim in Spain was starting to disappear by not only expelling the Muslim or asking them to convert, but also to do the same with Sephardic Jews and different traditions. So then if we go forward in time for another 150 years, we already see the crown of Portugal and the crown of Castilla in there, and we see something that is kind of close to the map of Spain today. I think this transition in history is very important for us to understand, and as Marta was saying before, there is something very powerful about memory loss when you think about it in a collective level. And looking at these maps and looking about how we decide to create our history or recreate it or remember the history, these maps simply remind us that all the situations or conversations that are going on today in that tiny corner of the world, which is the Iberian Peninsula, are not problems that started like 20 or 30 years ago, are problems that started thousands of years ago. And if we don't face those problems with full knowledge of where they are coming from, then they're going to repeat and repeat itself. So this is a map of Spain today. And we have 17 autonomous regions, and as many of you in this room may know, we have 4 official languages, which means that we also have other languages, but these are the only 4 that made it as official, which is Galician, Basque, and Catalan, and that's connected to the history that we were trying to look at in the last 3 minutes. So how do you tell the history of your country in like 4 minutes? That's the beauty of being a bagpiper. So, any questions so far? Great. So just to do a quick recap, if we think about the bagpipe from Galicia, or the bagpipes in general, we think about the bagpipe as being a shepherd instrument, bagpipes that were very present in Mediterranean cultures, and the Roman Empire was probably one of the most important ways of connecting the dots, but also the Celtic connections, which is something that we will get to a little bit later, but it also is connected to this idea of how do we decide how to reinvent our history, and when we Galicians decided that we are going to use the Celtic part of our history as the part that will represent ourselves. But the most interesting thing to me is to think about the Cantigas de Santa Maria. I don't know how many of you know the Cantigas or Alfonso X el Sabio. Yeah? Not really. So this is a collection of songs that are coming back to the 13th century, and for us Galicians, it's somehow like the first representation of our Galician bagpipe. This collection of songs are attributed to the King Alfonso X the Wise, and it will have like a little bit of music and then a little tiny miniature, like a Facebook size thing on the top left or the top right of each page, and those will be like the representations of different instruments that we assume those are the instruments they were using at that time. But for us, it's a way to say like bagpipes were so incredibly relevant in the Galicia of the 13th century that they even made it to a religious book that was devoting the Virgin Mary. The unique history of the instrument has helped me to try to understand the conversations that happen in between classes or in between different socioeconomic and status. The unique thing about the bagpipe is the fact that it is a community instrument. It was and it is a community instrument in pretty much every region that the bagpipe exists, except for a few regions. It also helps us to understand what is the place of the instrument in books or in history. So these are like books from the Syntagma Praetorium, Syntagma Musicae by Praetorium, and they depict different kinds of bagpipes, but they especially depict this one, which is the French Musette de Cour, which is one of the most developed and exquisite, excellent bagpipes of the time. And bagpipes were always referenced to different reference to rurality or reference to tradition or reference to community, and painters and musicians and composers somehow use them as a way to try to represent that particular part of history. These are paintings from Durero from the 1500s and Bruegel, and this one in particular to me really helps us understand a little bit the difference between the two different realities they represent. So if I were to ask you, what do you see here? What are the things that you see different or similar between the two pictures?
Ornamentation.
Ornamentation in your left or your right? In your left. Great. So we have ornamentation. What else do we see in there?
Upper class. Upper class.
Yeah, it looks rich and it looks poor, right? Yeah. Upper class, lower class. Yes.
And they play on different side.
Different size. Yes. Yes. Anything else that we see as a big difference?
Maybe nobility?
Maybe
nobility?
Nobility, yeah.
Common people.
Yeah.
There's a big, large
Drawn? Yeah. Yeah.
There's the focus on the individual versus the focus on community.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Thank you. That was a perfect line. Yeah, those things are very relevant because this is the French musette, the Musette de Cour, which is an instrument that was commissioned by Louis XIV during the Baroque time to bring the bagpipe up to the level of his kingdom, right? Like to bring the bagpipe to the court. So it's an instrument that doesn't have a blowpipe either. So the musician has to blow through the bellow. It's an instrument that the original versions, which they have a few of them in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, is made of ivory, and it has like a full set of drums, like 7 or something like that in there, that you really can have some sort of polyphonic sound with that unique instrument. And their realities, they represent community and they represent a different way of understanding music, music for the people or music to the people or music with the people. And the repertory that we have today, if you were to be a bagpiper in classical music, you will have to stick to the Musette de Cour, because at that time, that king actually commissioned composers like Lully and Rameau to write concertos or pieces for the Musette. So it's very interesting because there is another world of early music musicians that are connected to that particular instrument that somehow has a lot to do with our side of understanding the instrument, but it represents a completely different reality. So, recap. Galician gaita, the gaita gallega, the gaita galega. So the way to Santiago de Compostela, El Camino de Santiago, it is quite an important thing to remember. The fact that we were the capital of a pilgrimage Catholic route for hundreds of years. The fact that for hundreds of years we welcomed people that they all had in common religion, maybe, but they were coming from many different places. And all the things that are attached to that, like commerce and cultural exchange and different ways of understanding people. So somehow, to me, understanding the Galician bagpipe is understanding the Camino de Santiago, and the way my community, although it's kind of isolated in the northwest corner of Spain, is a community that actually has a little bit of everything. A little bit of what happened in the south of the country, a little bit of what happened in the north, and a lot of different exchanges that happens throughout the time of the Camino de Santiago. Medieval iconography is somehow the way we try to remember the history of the instrument, using the cantigas as a way of showing and showcasing it. And in the 14th and 15th centuries, we actually have like documents and papers that will help us understand that bagpipers were part of the society. There were contracts and documents made to hire a bagpiper for something or to be a bagpiper for a particular event. So they really made us understand that at that moment in history, the bagpipe was the center of our cultural identity. But then we enter what we call the séculos oscuros, which is more or less the dark centuries, which is between the 16th and the 18th century, in which our culture kind of like gets suppressed or disappears from the surface, but is still in there. And then back to the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, like if I were to ask you what was going on in Europe at the end of the 19th century, what are some of the movements that we can think of together? Industrial Revolution, right?
The market.
Romanticism, right?
The rise of the market.
The
mercado.
El mercado, the rise of the market.
Nationalism.
Revolution, nationalism, right? So if you put all that together and you take it to Galicia, somehow the Resurdimento is a product of that. And the Resurdimento is also the time in which the poet that really changed my life, in not only as a Galician, but also my life in the US, Rosalía de Castro, and all Galician poetry and music and history, and even the collections of Galician songs were made around that time, at the end of the 19th century, in what we call the Resurdimento of Galician culture, which is like the rebirth of Galician culture. But then we move into the 20th century, and we have a civil war that really changed history again, and we kind of go back in time in many aspects of life in Spain. But in the case of the historical nations like Galicia and Catalonia and Basque, that means many other things. That means a suppression of the language, that means a suppression of any representation of anything that was not Spanish from the perspective of the dictator, and that somehow helps us understand, for example, if you were not connected to like world music and you had no idea about the many different musics that are happening in Spain, if I were to ask you what is the first musical style that comes to your mind when we say Spain, what would that be?
Flamenco.
And somehow that was a political choice. So in trying to understand how much politics alter cultural identity or cultural identity alter politics is something that I have been living in between all times, especially because bagpipes represents that cultural identity of what it means to be Galician, speaking Gallego and playing bagpipes. And once you take that, you have a responsibility. For those of you that are bagpipe freaks, I'm very happy to show you the instrument up close after. I understand there is a reception, so I'm happy to just explain the specifics. But in a very basic level, I really love the English word for this instrument because it's very practical. A bagpipe is usually a bag and a set of pipes. And that's what makes a bagpipe a bagpipe. But in the case of the Galician one, you may have for sure the big drum, which is this one that it goes in your bag, that's called the ronco. And then depending on how you like the instrument or what is the capacity or what is the economical capacity you have to, you may have like the 2 or the 3 different drums. Each bagpipe will be tuned in a different key. This one in particular is in C, so the low drum over here is in a C low. And then you have this one over here in an upper C, and this tiny one is on the dominant, is on G. And the notes are coming from the chanter, from the front. Usually you blow into the bag, you fill it with air, and then it's your left arm and your constant breath that actually makes the instrument sound. And it became part of my body because, Marta, I'm going to correct you, and please, I don't want to embarrass you in there, but I began when I was 4, and I began recording when I was 12. So that's, yeah, you got that part. But somehow it became part of my body or part of my life, but I didn't choose it. And that somehow is what helps me understand my role as a bagpiper. So I'm going to shut up for a second, and I'm going to show you the Galician bagpipe in the Galician world. This is from a group that is called Noitarega. They are specialized in traditional Galician music, and what you're going to see, for those of you that have been in Galicia, like Megan over there, is going to be very familiar. What do you think? How many of you have been in Galicia? Oh, wow. That's amazing. Then you know this world, right? Wow. So that's how I grew up. Yeah, that's actually literally how I grew up. I'm the youngest of 4 sisters. And I started playing bagpipes when I was 4 because my sisters started playing bagpipes when I was 4. And I just wanted to be like my older sister, and I just follow her steps. She's 7 years older than me, and we have like one bagpipe for the whole family. I'm also the daughter of 2 parents who belong to what we call in Spain the hunger generation, the generation born around the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War. My father was born in 1937 and my mother was born in 1944. And although both of them come from rural Galicia in Ourense, 2 different regions, one from Nogueira de Ramoín and the other one from Abola, even those 2 little realities were very different from each other. In the case of my mother were 12 sisters, only 6 of them survived, and all of them women in rural Galicia. And my mother migrated to Venezuela, like many other Galicians back in the day. My father also migrated to Venezuela, and they actually met in Caracas. Well, my father was an accordion player in the Hermandad Gallega in Caracas, and my mother was just one of these Galicians that was trying to find their roots again in another part of the world. My parents also are from that generation that had little or no access to education. That generation and that part of the society that had to migrate, that there was no other choice for them. And in the case of my mother, that was very clear in the moment she started to raise a family, especially because she got 4 women in her family, that education, access to education, and the power and the ability to be the best in whatever educational endeavor we took on was very relevant to her, because that was her way of making us feel that we didn't have to go through the kind of whatever reality she went through. And we'll get a little bit into that later, because the way she created her history to us is something that fascinates me, especially because my mother suffers from frontotemporal dementia since 2012. And there is something horrible about that disease, but there is something beautiful about not having that filter anymore. So now she's accessing memories that were not part of the story that we had around my mother. Like when she moved to Venezuela, we knew she was a seamstress, una sastre, and that she was working in a store, and then she met my father, but she chose not to tell us that for 2-3 years she worked in house service as a servant to somebody else's family, which in Galician society, that's like something you hide, or they used to hide, and that's something that she would never do if she was in Galicia, but then she had to do that in Venezuela. So trying to create her own way of understanding who she is something that made me think about how much are we creating our history to try to understand who we are as a society. But long story short, the reason I collect degrees and the reason I began playing piano is because for my mother, being a bagpiper will represent being from the same part of the society that she was coming from. So if we thought that we wanted to create a career in music, that in her mind meant classical music. And she's the wisest woman I ever met. Even now with dementia, she's still the wisest woman I ever met. And this idea that she understood the invisible walls that there are in between classical music and folkloric music is something that stuck with me. Even in the moment I became famous, she was like, no, you had to get a doctorate because like this bagpipe thing is not gonna take you anywhere. And somehow that thing, because she is the love of my life, and it really represents strength and wisdom and love, like in capital letters. So I still have her in my mind even today when sometimes the conversation goes the other way around. Why I am telling this? Because it will help you maybe to understand some of my choices, but it may help you to understand where am I coming from. And even in my tiny little reality of Ourense in the middle of nowhere in Galicia, my story may have nothing to do with the story of like my husband. I have my sister-in-law in here who comes from a different kind of family than I come from. And their way of understanding whose history or society is very different from the way I understand it. And trying to make peace with this idea of that we're living in a world of multiple realities around us, and we have to respect and listen to those, and then try to create something that is maybe more diverse of what we have in our mind, is something that really drives my way of trying to understand my responsibility as a musician. So I want to go back in time a little bit, and this whole section is connected to the idea of who on earth needs a bagpiper. And just to give you an idea, in Ourense, in my generation, I was born in 1980, which is a few years after Franco, the dictator, dies. And in my generation, we had like another resurgimento, another rebirth of culture. Like that map that I was showing you before, that's when the Instituto de Autonomía de Galicia was created. So in my generation, speaking Gallego and playing Galician bagpipe and celebrating cultural difference was somehow kind of like not only relevant, but kind of like a must for all of us. I come from a city of 100,000 people, and in my generation, 10,000 of them had a connection to the bagpipe school. That means like 10% of the population. But the bagpipe school was next to the Conservatorio of Classical Music, which my sisters and I had to go because my mother obliged us to do it. But I could count with the fingers of my hand how many people was going to both places. And it was fascinating. But I loved playing piano. I also loved playing bagpipes. And I loved the way I could interact with audiences in both scenarios, which to me were like the opposite, right? With a bagpipe, you come in to the middle of the square, you go to the party, you wake up at like 6 a.m., go to like a village in the middle of nowhere, start playing at 7 a.m. In those narrow streets in Galicia. People wake up, they understand there is a party, then you wait for them where the church is, then there is pulpo and octopus and tortillas and beautiful things. And those kinds of scenes that you saw before actually still happen today. The bagpipe is somehow the center of Galician life. But as a classical pianist, you go on a stage, right? You wait for people to come to you. They sit, very respectful. They listen to you. You don't look at them, actually. You look at your instrument, and then you bow to them, and you leave. And it's not like one is better than the other. Both of them connect with us with different tools. And in trying to make peace, that one of them represented who I am and where I come from, and the other one actually represented most of my passions, is something that made me always feel that I was never either in one side or the other, that I was always in between. Long story short, 22 years ago, actually, I was 18 in those pictures, I became a solo bagpipe record, whatever, and it's interesting, especially because we are celebrating. I mean, this is under the celebrations of International Women's Day. But I was 18. I already had like a few recordings with other bands, like Mutenroy, which was the band that I was coming from, and was the band that was doing a little bit of like contemporary experimental pop rock with bagpipes. And at that time, in 1996, 1997, a record label kind of looked at them, and through looking at them, they got to me. And they thought, because at that time, Carlos Núñez and the bagpipe thing was already kind of like there. Carlos Núñez and José Ángel Evia became like famous bagpipe rock stars and things like that. You know, like history goes in cycles. So if you begin that cycle of re-celebrating national things, or like the idea of cultural identity, so 15 years later, the industry understands that and uses that as a way of building something that doesn't have anything to do with the original thought. So I'm a product of that, right? They saw there was something big behind those bagpipers, and then they thought, well, why don't we release a female bagpiper? And I became that person. And it was very unique because I come from a family of women, and all of them played bagpipes. I come from a school in which I don't know what were the statistics back in the day, but I have many female friends in my generation that were bagpipers. But then I became the first female Galician bagpipe player that records an album. And then I had to carry a responsibility that I was not ready to carry, or I didn't even understand what that meant. I was using my bagpipe to do the music I loved in that time when I was 18, which was a mixture of heavy metal and pop and punk and rock and a little bit of everything. And I was using the bagpipe the same way I was using piano, right? As a pianist, as a classical pianist, nobody questions the fact that you are playing a Latin American composer, or a German one, or an Austrian one, or an Israeli one. You just play piano, and through your instrument you play beautiful music coming from all around the world. But as a Galician bagpiper, back in the day, because history, really changes, and today is a different world than it was 22 years ago. Once you take the bagpipe out of the tradition, you have to actually build the story around that and protect yourself about the criticism that is going to come after you put the bagpipe in a completely different context. Let's say that I have fun. I was having fun being a bagpiper. I had an amazing band. I became kind of famous back in the day. I was doing like 150 shows a year, selling like a lot of albums. Like, I think my first album was like 30,000 copies in the first year, which for a bagpiper is a crazy thing. And I was everywhere, like in all media, like TV, public TV. I became some sort of like a pop star with a bagpipe. And somehow I became a product. And I had to learn how to live with that idea, because there are two realities that I needed to make peace with. One is that, which is, it's not like I didn't choose to be that, because I was that in that moment in life, but I didn't want that to represent the whole me. But it ended up being that way. But on the other side, I had my mother saying, I was already doing my master's degree when I was 18 years old, and I was my mother saying like, you have to finish your degree. And I mean, this is beautiful, but you have to finish your degree. In the moment I released my first album, Tolemia, in which life became kind of like beautifully difficult, she actually talked to the record label and talked to them to say, my daughter is not doing anything else until she gets her final examinations in May, then you can do whatever you want, but she has to do that. I already signed that contract, and the kind of contract that you used to sign back in the day before like reading it. So they were very nice, and they let me do whatever I had to do back in the moment, but then life went back to normal, and then I had to fulfill all my obligations of what it means to be a pop artist back in the day. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of the product that I became. And I am saying this very proud of my journey. I mean, like, I look back and I am incredibly fortunate and incredibly happy of all the things that I went through when I was 18 to when I was 23. But it fell into my hands, and I wasn't ready to understand what is or what was the responsibility I was carrying. Because when you play bagpipes and then you are tagged to be the first woman doing something, everything you say is relevant. Even if you don't think it's relevant, it becomes relevant. And I try to learn how to live with that. But on the other side, I come from a rural family, and classical music is incredibly expensive. So the bagpiper, the happy one, kind of helped me to get through the classical musician and helped me to come here and start my doctorate. So the two were informing the other, but I had to keep the product alive for a while to be able to sustain the thinker. So yes, I play 2 instruments, and I live 1,000 different worlds with both of them. I moved to the US in 2005 officially to start my doctoral degree after fulfilling the 5 years of obligations that I had with my record label to be able to move here. I tried to come to the US in 2003, which was when I actually fulfilled my contracts. And that was the time that my father, while I was doing my auditions here, died suddenly. And I had to return for a number of reasons, but mostly because, going back to the idea of that generation, my father was the provider. So then the 4 sisters had to at least start to think about a different way of supporting my mother's life. So I went back, and I went back to do what I used to do. But when I moved here, not only in 2003, but again in 2005, I moved to be away from the bagpiper. I didn't even bring my bagpipe both times. I didn't want to be that person for the rest of my life because I could see myself doing that for the rest of my life. It was fascinating, and it was very unique too. So I moved here, and when I came back after my father died, I remember talking to my mother and saying, I don't think I'm coming back to the US. I don't think it really makes sense. I'll look for another thing to do here in Spain. And then my mother grabbed my arm, like Galician style, the one that really leaves a hematoma in your body. And she was like, I didn't broke my back for you to give up on your dreams when your father dies. So you go back and you do whatever you need to do, and you need to get a doctorate. So all the sisters did whatever we could, and when the situation was sustained 2 years later, I decided to come back, and I had amazing help. A scholarship from the Fundación Barrio de la Maza allowed me not only to get my degree, but also to feel free of having to go on a stage to pay for my life. So for 3 years, I was a full-time researcher, a full-time student, and a full-time classical musician. And then I understood that I actually didn't want to be that anyway. But there has to be something for me in between. There has to be a path that I could create for myself that could combine the 2 realities. As a bagpiper, I do a little bit of everything. I do jazz, I do classical contemporary music, and I do traditional music. I try to create little packages or little products that in which I can try to tell the stories that I want to tell as a musician, but also as a human being. And what you see on the top left is my New York quartet, which are musicians from the jazz world, and we explore the idea of jazz through my instrument. And that actually doesn't come as a new thing for some people. I started being a jazz musician in New York because of the Miles Davis Sketches of Spain album. And because actually, I'll tell you that story a little bit later. But then what you see on the bottom left is my Galician trio, which we explore more like Galician traditional music with a contemporary hint. And what you see on your right is my other side as a pianist, and also the person that has changed my life in so many different levels, which is Yo-Yo Ma, and the reason that I started working connected to this particular institution, Harvard University. With the bagpipe, I ended up in places I will never even dream about being. From jazz standard to Hollywood Bowl with Yo-Yo Ma and the Silver Ensemble, to the White House with the Turnaround Arts program of the President's Committee of the Arts and the Humanities during the Obama administration. And with hip-hop dancers like Lil Back, who then became like the dancer for Madonna. And it is fascinating because once I left Galicia, I thought the bagpipes were not relevant. Well, they actually are not relevant, right? Like, I have to push my way into things. But once they hear it, or once they see the attached value that the instrument can bring in, then magic happens, and another door, an unexpected one, comes and opens itself for you. And that doesn't mean it's easy, but it's fascinating to understand that sometimes you are the ones that have the limits in your own mind, and those limits are very limiting most of the time. When I moved to the US, there was a piece of music that changed my way of understanding my life in this country, but I actually came in as a doctoral student with the idea of coming back after my PhD. But then magic happened again, and I will get to that story in a little bit. But after I graduated and after I started working with Yo-Yo Ma and then with Silk Road, I met a group of musicians in New York that were putting together the 50th anniversary of Miles Davis' Sketches of Spain. I don't know how many of you know that album, Sketches of Spain? A little bit? Yeah.
Very famous.
Yeah, okay, so Sketches of Spain somehow is the way this part of the world try to understand Spanish music through jazz, right? Like Miles Davis somehow was a channel to that. Miles Davis was using the work of ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax, American ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax back in the day, to listen to the sources that he was recording in Spain even before that particular album, and then using that sources to create this beautiful album that is Sketches of Spain. The opening piece is called Bagpiper. And apparently, when I got the call from a producer in New York, he was like, I'm looking for a Galician musician in New York that plays something close to a bagpipe. And we are not that many. So I got lucky, very lucky. And then he's played me the whole thing, the bagpiper, the original recording, the original field recording, which you can find right now at Smithsonian Online Foundation, is open for everybody here to access it. It comes from a little village in Ourense, which is in Nogueira de Ramuín, in Faramontaos, which is like 2 kilometers away from where my father was born. Like, speaking of unique coincidences, what on earth was Miles Davis doing when he was listening to like a pig castrator from Galicia? Because the region where my father comes from, they were famous for being amazing knife sharpers and pig castrators. And the sound of that bagpiper thing is the typical sound that you will hear in the streets, not so much now, but even like when I was growing up, the sound that will tell the story that there is a knife sharper here, or there is a pig castrator in the village, because we all need a pig castrator. So that was the particular story behind how did I end up being a jazz musician. I arrived to the studio, and the studio were, I think, 32 musicians. That means 32 men and me. And it was Chick Corea, and Jack DeJohnette, and Jerry Gonzalez, and Alex Acuña, and John Benitez, and Carlos Benavent, and Jorge Pardo. Like, all my idols were all together in there. I was scared to death. And then this producer, Bob Belden, who is no longer with us, was like, okay, this is the line, do whatever you do. I began playing, and nobody was surprised. I mean, surprised in the say that nobody questioned the fact of what I was doing. So that gave me the okay to maybe try to explore that language a little bit more and try to understand jazz as a language that somehow came from a very particular reality, became the life of another particular reality, and then there are 1,000 things happening in between what was the origin of that particular language and what is today. So I started recording for Sunnyside Records, which is one of the most fascinating jazz record labels in the US, and I thought that because nobody needed a bagpiper, maybe I could think about conceptual recordings, like helping them to understand why bagpipes and why bagpipes in jazz. And that's somehow what I've been trying. I'm happy to give you the link for the Miles Español video, because it's a wonderful way of trying to understand the power of connecting the dots. How is this going, by the way?
Great.
Yeah? Do you have like 3 more hours? What about like 15 more minutes? Is that okay?
Great.
Okay. So going back to the whole idea of where I come from and what is the instrument that represents me, once I decided that I wanted to be part of this community too, and that I wanted to contribute to both places, both Galicia and both New York, where I live, then I started to think about where are the stories that I can tell with my instrument that sometimes are impossible stories to tell with your voice or with a paper about something. I met Matt Swift, composer and violinist and activist, through Silk Road a couple of years ago, and she was working on a collection of pieces devoted to children that were victims of police brutality, random victims of police brutality. And the way she presented those compositions, like just as a fact, as a way of those names to be remembered and those names to be visible to the part of the society that really doesn't see what's going on that reality, made me think about what are the other invisible communities of my community that I'm not even aware that they exist. So we started collaborating with this idea of invisibility through music, bringing up invisible communities through commissioning other composers. And then somehow, as an honor to my mother, and for those of you who are local too, I started a project that is called the Bagpiper and Orchestra Commissioning Project. I just wanted to prove her wrong. Like, I wanted to say that, hey, we made it. We put the bagpipe in the center of classical music. First I tried to convince orchestras to commission composers to write concertos for bagpipe and orchestra, and I got the same laugh I get all the time. I say I'm a professional bagpiper. And then I thought, well, then I'll do it myself. And I decided to use a percentage of what I was making every year to pay composers to write pieces for bagpipe and orchestra. And then I ended up with beautiful pieces, and there were no orchestras interested in doing them. And then I had to find a way of convincing those. And Lori is in the room in here, but it's fascinating how the work of Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble in places like Chautauqua, in trying to open the space for these kinds of conversations, can actually open the door for these other conversations to happen. So for those of you that are local, one of the concertos, Widows for the Living and for the Deaf, is going to be performed in April 19th in Mechanics Hall in Worcester, here in Massachusetts, with the Boston Conservatory Orchestra. So that's going to be a very unique experience with the students. So for a while, I thought, maybe that's it. Maybe that's what I was meant to be doing, and then what? What happens when you've been on a stage for 22 years and you don't feel like being on a stage full-time anymore? What are the things that you want to hang on? And what are the things that I do as a performer and as a teacher that could keep my passion up? And that's when Silk Road became like a very big, important part of my life. How many of you know of Silk Road? How many of you have seen Silk Road perform? Okay, how many of you have no idea what Silk Road is? Perfect. So Silk Road is a collective that was put together also 20 years ago by Yo-Yo Ma. And he began this project just as an idea of using the Silk Road as a metaphor to connect cultures and to showcase cultural exchange through music. He began just bringing musicians from China, Mongolia, Korea, and all the Middle East, and somehow the whole thing expanded, and it expanded to Galicia because of Rosalía de Castro. Silk Road is the organization that brought me to Harvard University because it's affiliated to this institution. It's also the organization that changed my life because it made me understand that there is an in-between in there. There is an in-between musical languages, classical music and folkloric music, but also Yo-Yo created that space for those difficult conversations to happen. And to me, the lesson we are learning after 20 years is those conversations do not get easier over time. They are difficult, and they go back to hundreds and thousands of years. And those are conversations about socioeconomical realities, about cultural identities, and about different ways of understanding the role of a musician. But Yo-Yo was able to at least begin to open the door for all of us to show at least the idea that there is relevance with these unique instruments that are quite invisible for the classical music world. And Silk Road commissions composers to write pieces for this unique collaborative ensemble. Sometimes you end up playing bagpipes and piano at the same time at Carnegie Hall. And that's like, okay, after this circus freak, what do I do? But what you see on a stage, and I'm quoting Yo-Yo Ma here, is somehow the tip of an iceberg. And everything that is below water is all the values that every musician or every person in the room is actually sustaining their life. In the case of Silk Road, those values are about education and are about listening and about connecting with the other or stepping toward the other. And Yo-Yo became my mentor in many different ways through Silk Road, but especially Yo-Yo, the humanist, is the person that changed my life. Understanding that he could have been playing Dvorak cello concerto forever and ever and not having to worry about anything else. He started Silk Road. Now he's no longer, he's just the founder, right? He's just one of us in there. And now he started the Bach project, which is like a huge, intense program that is going on around the world for the next 2 years. And somehow with that, he keeps inspiring me into trying to understand what are the values that we as musicians practice every day that could be relevant to other disciplines.
One of the topics I've been reading about recently
Can you hear?
is what kind of workforce we need in the 21st century. What will our graduates need in
That's
order
it.
to succeed? The experts say we need 4 qualities in our students and in our workforce. They need to be collaborative, flexible, imaginative, innovative. Now, according to the 2012 IBM Global CEO study, collaboration...
Let's see, I'm gonna go back because the back of the room was not
One of the
hearing,
topics
okay?
I've been reading about recently
Is
is
it
what
better?
kind of workforce we need in the 21st century. What will our graduates need in order to succeed? The experts say we need 4 qualities in our students and in our workforce. They need to be collaborative, flexible, imaginative, innovative. Now, according to the 2012 IBM Global CEO study, collaboration is the #1 trait CEOs are seeking in their employees, with 75% of CEOs calling it critical. The Council on Competitiveness says those who learn to innovate will prosper in a global economy. The Center for Public Education trumpets creativity and intellectual flexibility as crucial competencies. Now, we know that our present educational system encourages knowledge acquisition and critical thinking. But what about these other qualities? How do we develop them? Let's take my favorite example of creativity from science. In ecology, the point where 2 ecosystems meet, such as the forest and the savanna, that point is called edge effect. In that transition zone, because of the influence the 2 ecological communities have on each other, you find the greatest diversity of life, as well as the greatest number of new life forms. So that's one way nature is creative.
That was part of the Nancy Hanks lecture from 2013, which was part of a lecture tour that the Yo-Yo started to put together back in the day, that I had the honor to join him as a pianist, as a co-lecturer somehow, and as a bagpiper. And understanding all the values and all the ways he has been understanding his own career really blew my mind and made me think that maybe being in between wasn't such a bad thing. That Edge Effect video, it was some sort of a revelation. It was a moment in which I was like, I'm that person that is in between worlds, in between communities, in between different socioeconomical worlds. And as a musician, and as an educator, and as a migrant, I'm constantly in that zone. And I met Yo-Yo and I met Silk Road because of the greatest inspirations for all Galicians, which is Rosalía de Castro, somehow our muse. And I think this is going to be loud now, but... So this is Lua Descolorida, which is a poem by Rosalía de Castro that was set to music by Osvaldo Golijov. I am putting that piece because I was on my second semester at Rutgers University when I get a call from the head of the vocal department. And as you already know, when I moved here, I didn't even tell my school that I had another life. I applied as a pianist, which didn't have anything to do with the bagpiper, so they really were not that much aware of what I was or what I was doing before I moved to the US. I am a vocal coach and a chamber pianist. My doctoral degree is in collaborative piano, which means like chamber music repertoire and vocal repertoire, which means collaboration constantly. And in my second semester, I get this call from the head of the vocal department, and she says, hey, I have a piece of music of a composer that is coming to give a master class in a couple of weeks. I don't know what language it is, but it looks like Spanish. Would you like to take a look? And maybe you can help the soprano with diction and coaching. And I say, sure, of course. So she sends me that Lua Descolorida. She sends me the score that Osvaldo Golijov put together. And then it was like, oh, I began crying, right? Like when you move away from your own community and you are far and you don't have the money to go back as much as you wanted. Like anything Galician at that moment, it would make me cry like in a second. But you know, the fact that you are in a school in the middle of New Brunswick, New Jersey, and then you get like this piece of a Galician poet, it was like, okay, there is a message in here that I need to listen to. Long story short, Osvaldo Golijov, who I consider kind of my little saint in here, and he wrote that piece. He put that piece in the center of a beautiful, beautiful masterpiece that is called La Pasión según San Marcos. That back in the day, it was huge, like huge around the world, but also huge in the US. And somehow he put Galician language in the center of contemporary classical music, and in Galicia, nobody was aware of that. And he was not aware of the fact that how important it was, the fact that that piece was like in the climax of his passion. And we became friends. Then he fell in love with the sound of the Galician bagpipe. He had no connection to Galicia. I mean, he's an Argentinian, Russian, Jewish composer, and his connection to Rosalía de Castro was because he was working on a Federico García Lorca piece at the moment, and García Lorca loved Rosalía de Castro. So that's how he ended up being connected to my language. Osvaldo Golijov, in 2006, was writing a piece for Silk Road, and because he fell in love with the bagpipes, he invited me to just come in and show up to one of their workshops in Tanglewood. To be honest, I mean, I kind of knew who Yo-Yo Ma was, but I really didn't have an idea of how famous he was. I went to Lenox, Massachusetts, and I showed up. A bunch of people were there. I played, I did my thing. I had no shame. I mean, I have less, yeah, like this was like 15 years ago, so I was not apologetic about anything. And then I realized that that was the moment that was going to change my life, right? In that room, it was most of the Silver Ensemble members, but also the head of the New York Times, the head of Carnegie Hall, the head of Juilliard. And 2 weeks after that, I was performing with them at Carnegie Hall. And the whole thing started. And I know it sounds like weird and kind of ridiculous, but it's actually how it happened. Like from a Friday to another Friday, all of a sudden the bagpipe was in the center of that conversation. And by stretching what it meant to bring the bagpipe into Silk Road, I began to understand how would I be stretching myself to be relevant, not only to my community, but also to the next community. So what is Silk Road? To me, Silk Road is many things. And as a musician, I really enjoy being on stage with them and touring around the world and being in amazing spaces. But what really keeps me connected to Silk Road is that edge effect that Yo-Yo was talking about. The fact that Silk Road has been at Harvard for many years, but not at the music department, that is trying to create that edge in between different departments, like the Harvard Business School, through the Cultural Entrepreneurship Challenge that began, I don't know, like 10 years ago, Laurie, or like 9 years ago? Yeah, and it was this idea that Nitin Noria, the dean of the Harvard Business School, and Diana Sorensen and Yo-Yo had to why don't we create a challenge for students from the Harvard Business School to create a project with the students from the humanities? And that sounds like a easy thing to do, but it's not so easy to connect those dots. And they had to solve a problem of the society through a cultural endeavor. So I have a person in the room in here who has just won a prize like 3 weeks ago in Detroit, in the Sphinx. Would you just introduce yourself for a second?
Hi,
Yeah.
everybody. I'm Gabrielle. I was so lucky to meet Cristina here at Harvard, but also recently at the Sphinx competition where I pitched my venture, which is also around music and intercultural dialogue. And
Yeah, so like if she was here like 10 years ago, that would be an amazing example of a cultural entrepreneurship program, which is not about creating an industry or making culture a transaction. It's about putting culture as the conversation, as the table, as you say, for those conversations to happen. Somehow that had an impact in my own way of understanding my role in Galicia, so I created a festival to try to connect the dots, and then I began working with academic institutions in Galicia to try to connect the dots between different projects that they were putting together, and my approach as a producer, as an academic, and as a musician to try to create something that was unique for those institutions. And the most important part of my work with Silk Road is connected to the Harvard Graduate School of Education and to the Arts and Passion-Driven Learning Institute here at Harvard University. And I'm going to embarrass a friend of mine who is in the room because she came into my life 8 years ago as the learning person for Silk Road, and she became my mentor and somehow my best friend in all these years. And that's Lori Taylor, who is in the back of the room looking at me like, I hate you, Cristina. I'm stepping in this summer to try to fill your shoes, Lori Taylor, as the co-director of the Arts and Passion-Driven Learning Institute here at Harvard University, along with my other mentor, Professor Steve Seidel. And I mean, this is a very unique environment for teachers and teaching artists, and for trying to understand what is the role of an artist in academia, but also what is the role of the arts in society. And we try to use framing questions that will help us understand what are the connections between all the conversations that are going on in there. And these are some of the framing questions that we used in the past, which are connected to listening across difference, which is somehow what you do as a bagpiper, trying to listen across difference, but it's also something that we forgot how to nurture in the educational system. And finally, this idea of being in between and becoming a professional in-betweener helped me understand that unless I found an excuse to do things, I will just change the subject and move to another thing. when my mother was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, I was already fascinated with neuroscience. I was already like working with this idea of music and the impact of music in your brain and in memory, but more like in a physical way, not so much in a philosophical way. And then when I began seeing how my mother was rebuilding her own way of understanding herself and the role of music in that too, then I began talking also through Laurie Taylor at UC Santa Barbara with a neuroscientist, Dr. Kenneth Gossett, who is one of the co-discoverers of the early onset of Alzheimer's gene in Antioquia in Colombia. And this is a gene that if you carry it and it hits you when you are like around 40 years old, and it takes you out in less than 7 years. It's a very aggressive and a very cruel version of Alzheimer's disease. But because it is kind of contained into a very big family, and I say family in terms of genetic connections of like thousands of people, they are now kind of the center of the conversation of scientific research on memory loss, because they know if they carry the gene, they know they are going to get it. So if you are trying to look for a cure, those are the people that can actually be the guides to take you there. The reason we connected is because that gene, when they started to take, how do you say, árbol genético? Genetical tree? Yeah, like the genetical tree. Then when they started to trace it back and back and back, it was connected to a Spanish conquistador in the 1500s. Among all the horrible things we brought to the Americas, we also brought early onset of Alzheimer's. And Ken Kosick, this neuroscientist, is a humanist who became a scientist. And I am a humanist who are a musician, but also wanted to be a scientist. So we started to talk about this idea of cultural memory and cultural memory loss. And then we created this class that we do every other year at the University of California in Santa Barbara, in which Professor Kim Yasuda from the Public Art Department, Kenneth Kosick and myself bring together over like 17 faculty members from different disciplines, sociology, anthropology, and theater, and virtual reality, and we try to address the idea of memory loss from those different perspectives. It's a collaborative class where students have to create projects together, they have to work together, and they have to target the conversations that are going on today and look at them from the perspective of memory. And I'm gonna leave it here. And I'm just gonna say that I was very fortunate, incredibly. I mean, I'm the luckiest person on earth. Like, things came to my life in a way that I cannot even explain. Those magical moments like Osvaldo coming to my life with Rosalía de Castro and Lua Descolorida that took me to Yo-Yo Man, Silk Road. Like, even if I was ambitious and I was trying to create a career, I mean, I would have never even dared to dream about the things that I got in the last 22 years. I got very lucky, but also I had to develop what my mother told me all my life, that whatever you get, don't get too comfortable because it's gonna change and you're gonna lose it in a second. So I created what I call my alphabet plan, in which I have the A plan, the B one, the C one, the E, all of them until Z. And that's my way to try to think that if something doesn't work the way I expect it, at least I have something else. And that's the whole idea about being in between and about carrying multiple truths and making peace about that idea. Because when I'm here, I am a Galician. When I'm in Galicia, I am no longer a Galician, right? I'm the person that moved to New York. And as a musician, when I am playing piano, the bagpiper disappears. And when I'm playing bagpipers, they kind of like don't even understand why should I be playing piano also. And as an educator, I don't even fit in academic institutions because I don't want to teach music. And I actually think it's relevant that musicians and artists are connected to disciplines that are not directly connected to the discipline they come from. Because we have the ability of connecting the dots and being creative the same way scientists are and are connected to those other realities. So I am a professional in-betweener, and I am very proud of that aspect of my life, but that doesn't mean it gets easier. It gets more and more difficult, but I've been blessed with all the institutions and organizations that have trusted me in the last 10 years, including Harvard and Silroot and Yo-Yo Ma, who I work for now as an independent producer and curator for the Bach Project, the University of California, Americans for the Arts, and Opus 3, and the international cooperation aspect of the Galician government. And I also write. And since the beautiful position that I have in NYU ends at the end of May, and I promised myself that I was going to give myself a space for that writer to happen. So the next semester I will be taking 4 months off to write that novel that has been hitting my head for the last 4 years. And that's pretty much it. It's 7 p.m. I'm happy to take questions or to continue the conversation on the reception, and that's a question for you. So, I wonder how comfortable you are in there. How are you? You're okay? So I wonder if you had some questions that you think they were relevant, or do you prefer to continue the conversation with some food and drinks outside? You have the two choices, and I'm okay either way.
I just want to thank you. I don't think I've been engaged in a conversation like this or a talk, I can't remember.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What is your name? Oh.
Stephanie, she's my mom.
Stephanie. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie.
It's very inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you.
You just we could hear your jazz playing, a sample, a minute or two.
Oh, sure, yeah. Can I play you a video? I mean, because just by myself is kind of sad. Yeah. I'll put that video once we go into any other. Yes.
I'm curious what your book's going to be about.
So,
And what language you'll write it in?
I'm writing in Galician because that's the language I chose to write in, although that's not the language I was raised on. Because as the daughter of rural, people that was coming from the Galician, long story short, Galician was not the language of prestige in Galicia. So for Galician people coming from rural communities, you grew up in a very unique environment in which my parents would talk in Galician among themselves and with their brothers, but every time they would talk to us, it would be in Spanish. And our Spanish had to be like a very clean Spanish. So I embraced Galician. I was bilingual. We are all bilingual in Galicia. But I embraced Galician as my full-time language. It's very late in my life, when I was like 25, when I was already here, and I understood what it meant to just give up that language just because it represented, what Franco wanted it to represent back in the day. So yeah, it's gonna be in Galician. That's how I write my columns for a newspaper, and I had a translator who is also connected to this institution, right, Monica, who translates my Galician into English, because I don't think I have the ability to write in English in the way I can write in Galician. And the question was, what is it about? What is it about, right? That was the question. It's a very long story, but to make it very short, it is about a person which is inspired by my defunct father, who used to do what in Spain we call menudeo, like used to live out of selling small things here and there. And my father, when he died, he was selling jewelry to people that would never go to a jewelry store or anything like that. So he would sit in a bar, and his clients were like bar goers or things like that. And he had these little cards in which each one of those clients would choose how much they wanted to pay each week. And he would come back to that bar every Monday or every Tuesday. He had different locations around the city. Because my father died suddenly, we had like a lot of money that we needed to collect. And yeah, this is the private part of this video, so if we publish this, but which is that back on bagpipes that you were asking about before. And if you look for Miles Español, the recording sessions, you will hear a little bit of this Galician bagpipe thing.
Not only was it feel, music, form,
Can I just mention that we actually have
It sounds like Miles. It's not him, it's
a
a sound.
chapter in
It's
one of our
an
recent
current
issues
thing.
devoted to sketches of Spain
So-
by Miles
Oh, really?
Davis. Yeah, and
This
the
way,
connection with Joaquin
these
Rodrigo. This
musicians
was
who
published
heard
only
about
3
playing
months
Spanish
ago.
music.
Oh, wow.
By Antonio Pizza.
Yes, yeah, from the Iberian, yeah.
He wrote the article devoted to
Oh, wow.
Spain.
It's always been a tradition to get the
So YouTube, Miles Español, New Sketches of Spain. That's the name of the album. And I can't play jazz by myself. That's the beauty of jazz. I mean, I can improvise, but I won't be improvising in that language. But I'm gonna, if that's okay, I'm gonna play a Galician traditional la la la. So that way the whole circle is in there. Where's the other one? Oh boy, yes, that's. Oh no, that was the projector. That light is killing me. It's okay. I'll get closer in here. Yeah.
A fascinating lecture to celebrate this special day. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.